The LA Clippers has always been the little brother to the Lakers ever since arriving in Los Angeles. You go outside of the Staples Center and it's nothing but statues of the greatest Lakers players. Inside, there's no different. Banners of the success of the Lakers and some of the greatest players to ever play in the purple and gold. Nothing relevant for the Clippers. Looking at the history of this franchise, it's been nothing but mediocrity and bad luck. And in this video, I'm going to be discussing the curse of the Clippers still continue. Enjoy. The Los Angeles Clippers are very well known for a few things. One is obviously having a notorious racist as your owner for decades. But one more thing is not ever making it past the second round of the playoffs. Something that could have changed this season, but the curse still lives on. They've had opportunities to make it to the Western Conference Finals a few times, but something just always happens. Not only that, but this franchise over the decades have made some extremely bad decisions that's also part of their curse. Let's get into this. The Braves made the playoffs 3 out of 8 seasons, led by legendary head coach Dr. Jake Ramsey. But despite Ramsey's early success, he will be fired by the Clippers owner Paul Schneider. The assistant coach Tate Locke would become the head coach, and they wouldn't make the playoffs for the next 15 seasons. Coach Ramsey was hired by the Portland Trail Blazers immediately, and that was the year the Blazers won the NBA championship in 1977. First off, this coach led this team to the playoffs 3 seasons. Not only that, he was already an established head coach. Then you fire him, and that's when really everything started to fall apart. At that moment, this was when the curse began. The Buffalo Braves were introduced in 1970 as an expansion team. The team's first star was Bob McAdoo. He showed promise for a young Brave team at the time. He would even go on to win the 1974-75 MVP. Not realizing they had a future Hall of Famer on the team, the Braves traded him in 1976 for John Ginelli and cash. McAdoo would go on to have a Hall of Fame career and win 2 NBA championships. For Gallinari, he only would average 7 points per game in his one season for the Braves. In 1978, the Braves were able to acquire Moses Malone, yes, the Hall of Famer Moses Malone, for a first-round pick and cash. And Malone was only 21 at the time, so his career was really about to take off. But you really can't recall him playing for the Braves because he only played 2 games. Coach Tate Locke only played Malone 6 minutes in his 2 games when Malone was there. And obviously Malone was complaining about his minutes time, and he was immediately traded to the Rockets for draft picks. The biggest finesse in NBA history. Locke was fired a few weeks later. And guess what? Obviously, Malone will go on to have a Hall of Fame career, and he will go on to win NBA championships. That next season, in 1978, the Braves will relocate to San Diego, and they will officially change their name to the San Diego Clippers. In October 1978, the Clippers acquired World B. Free, giving the 76ers a first-round pick in the 1984 NBA draft. Free was a dominant player at the time. He averaged well over 30 points a game, one of his best seasons for the Clippers. But that draft pick would end up being Charles Barkley. Knowing the Clippers, though, even if they still had that draft pick, they wouldn't have been able to pick Charles Barkley anyway. And not only that, but we all know Charles Barkley will go on to have a Hall of Fame NBA career. He's one of the greatest power forwards of all time. And that is another Hall of Famer this team missed out on. In 1979, the Blazers received Kermit Washington, forward Kevin Kernan, and a journeyman center Randy Smith, a high-scoring guard, and a first-round pick in that next year's NBA draft, in exchange for signing Bill Walton. But the Clippers owner really wasn't worried at the time because he didn't know, obviously, that Bill Walton, well, he missed 203 games over the past 5 seasons due to repeated stress fractures in his feet. In the end, well, Bill Walton only played 169 games for the Clippers, 34% of his 6-year contract. And you know what's something that's interesting about that? Well, Walton would end up being traded for Cedric Maxwell in 1985. He will go on to win an NBA championship, and he won 6th Man of the Year, and he played 96 out of 100 games for the Celtics. Now that's tough. In 1981, Donald Sterling bought the Clippers from Irv Levin for $12.5 million. And obviously, as we know from this point on, it got worse. The Clippers did make a really good draft pick selecting Tom Chambers. They doubled down that by selecting Terry Cummings, who won Rookie of the Year. Cummings and Chambers would combine to play in 6 All-Star games and 228 combined playoff games. But none of these games were for the Clippers, as Cummings and Chambers were both traded away in the summer of 1984. Wow. The San Diego Clippers, at best, were terrible. This team missed the playoffs 6 straight seasons in San Diego, and the team would eventually be moved to Los Angeles.
Lucas.
In 1984, the Clippers held the 8th and 14th picks in one of the best draft classes, obviously, in NBA history. But remember, this is the Clippers we're talking about here. This is the most cursed franchise in the history of basketball. They took Lancaster Gordon ahead of Kevin Williams and Otis Thorpe, as well as Michael Cage, 2 spots ahead of John Stockton. In 1986, the Clippers found themselves with a new GM, Lakers legend Elgin Baylor. Baylor took over immediately, and he made moves requiring 2 first-round picks, trading Cedric Maxwell and Curtis Nimpus. Well, Baylor made bad decisions in the 1987 NBA draft. In that draft, he selected Reggie Williams, the 4th overall pick, ahead of Scottie Pippen, Kevin Johnson, Horace Grant, and Reggie Miller. Baylor also drafted Joe Wolf at 13th and Kenny Norman at 19th, instead of Mark Jackson and Reggie Lewis. The guys Baylor drafted were never All-Stars, while the other guys, as we all know, would be All-Stars and Hall of Famers. In 1988, luck was on the Clippers' side by acquiring the number 1 draft pick. The hype was really high at the time around the prospect Danny Manning. He was the consensus number 1 pick. He was seen as a guy who could possibly be a future Hall of Famer, an All-Star. But he would tear his ACL in just 26 games into his rookie season. He was never the same player he could have been. In 1991, the Clippers had a little luck on their hands, having a lineup of Danny Manning, Ron Harper, Doc Rivers, and Olden Polynice. This team won 45 games, and they even took the Jazz to 5 games in the first round. They also hired head coach Larry Brown in the middle of that season, but they already had 2 coaches already during that season to begin with. This core was young, and they had a lot of room to grow, and Brown even said to Sports Illustrated that he could see himself being there for a long time, and he would like to be there for a long time. But he did have problems with Danny Manning, and those problems escalated even further, which made him resign as the head coach following that next season. From that point on, the Clippers decided to blow everything up. That talented young core they had after Brown's departure, Elgin Baylor traded away Rivers and Polynice for a package that gave the Clippers Stanley Roberts, William Bedford, Don McLean, and Mark Jackson. They then traded McLean and Bedford to Washington for John Williams. Absolutely terrible moves. And the Clippers didn't make the playoffs for another 14 years. In the 1995 NBA draft, Elgin Baylor decided to draft Antonio McDyess over Rasheed Wallace, Jerry Stackhouse, and Kevin Garnett. and Michael Olowokandi over Mike Bibby, Vince Carter, Dirk Nowitzki, and Paul Pierce, and Antoine Jameson in 1998. As we all know, these guys were all-stars, and some are Hall of Famers now. And McDyess obviously had a pretty solid NBA career, but he never even played for the Clippers. Thank God, I know he's happy. And for Michael Olowokandi, we all know that he was a huge bust, and he wouldn't even accept the guidance of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Sad. Absolutely sad. Now entering the 21st century, the Clippers were no different. They were terrible. Elgin Baylor was still the general manager at the time, but he did make a pretty solid move by acquiring Elton Brand from the Chicago Bulls for a draft pick in the 2001, 2 future first-round picks for Lorenzen Wright, and a first-round pick for Corey Maggette. But he messed up this fast by selecting Chris Wilcox in 2002 in the NBA draft ahead of Amari Stoudemire and Caron Butler, 2 future All-Stars, for a guy who only averaged 8 points per game for his entire NBA career. Oh, you think I'm done yet? No, of course not. It's the Clippers we're talking about here. In the 2003 draft class, this was obviously one of the best draft classes of all time, led by stars LeBron, Chris Bosh, Dwayne Wade, and Carmelo Anthony. The Clippers selected Chris Kaman with the 6th overall draft pick, and even if they did have a top 5 pick in that year's NBA draft, they probably would have selected Darko Milicic. Let's be real. In the 2004 NBA draft, the Clippers moved down, selecting Sean Livingston. Livingston had a pretty good, solid first 2 years for the Clippers. But then in 2007, in a game against the Bobcats, he suffered obviously one of the worst injuries in basketball history. This injury was so bad because he dislocated his kneecap after landing really bad on it, and it was so bad to the point that they thought that his whole leg would have to be amputated. Luckily, he would return after rehab, but he was never really the same player from that point on, but he still had some success in his NBA career, but on other NBA teams. The Clippers won 47 games in 2006 and finally made the playoffs. They beat the Denver Nuggets in the first round, and they were up against the 7 seconds or less Phoenix Suns led by Steve Nash and Amari Stoudemire. The Clippers actually had an opportunity to possibly take lead in this series in Game 5. The series was tied at 2 games apiece, and with less than 5 seconds on the clock in Game 5, the Clippers looked like they could possibly make a good play. But for some reason, Mike Dunleavy decided to sub in Daniel Ewing, who never played 1 minute in the entire NBA. And you matched him up against Raja Bell, one of the best 3-point shooting players in the entire NBA. And Phoenix would win that game in double overtime, and they will win the series in 7 games. They were never the same from that point on. That was really their first opportunity to really make it big. But they will eventually blow up this roster, and Baylor was finally fired, which was something that needed to happen 30 freaking years ago, for crying out loud. He should have been fired a long time ago. This man made so many bad decisions as general manager that it just didn't make any sense. Just constant bad luck in the draft, and you trade away so many guys that you had an opportunity to have something with. This was a blessing in disguise. But a few years later down the line, luck was on the Clippers side because they were able to select Blake Griffin in the 2009 NBA draft with the first pick. He would miss the entire season due to injury, but he did have a good 2010 season, and he also won Rookie of the Year, and he was an All-Star. The future was bright for LA with Blake Griffin. In 2012, the Clippers got a big win by trading for Chris Paul, for Eric Gordon, Al-Farouq Amino, and some other small pieces. Also, with the emergence of DeAndre Jordan and Blake Griffin, the Clippers finally had a great core. This core, as we all know, were known as Lob City. And they also had Doc Rivers as the head coach, which was another really good asset for this team. This team was starting to become a championship team, and they were consistently making the playoffs. This was really a new era for the Clippers, and at the time, the Lakers were on the departure, so there had to be a team who could leave that success in, and that team was obviously the Clippers. They did make the playoffs in 2013, and they were up 2-0 against the Grizzlies. But Blake Griffin got hurt in Game 4, and the Grizzlies would end up winning 4 straight games to win that series. This was their first loss. Fast forward in 2015, the Clippers beat a veteran Spurs team from the floater by Chris Paul. And they obviously faced against the Rockets in that next series, and they even had a 3-1 lead. But then Josh Smith, out of all people, started to take over, and the Rockets gained all that momentum back, and they won that series in 7 games. And that was Chris Paul's really big first opportunity to really make it to the Western Conference Finals and for the Clippers in general. But they blew it. And really from that point on, in 2016, injuries ruined everything. Blake got hurt in 2017 in the first round, and they were already suffering from locker room issues. That's what really ruined this team. Injuries is really the bad part for this team. So many guys were hurt, and then you add on to the locker room problems that this team had. They eventually had to blow everything up. This team was a legitimate championship contender team with the pieces they had on their roster, but they had to move on, and they traded Chris Paul to the Rockets. And Blake, he re-signed with the Clippers, but they would end up trading him to the Pistons. And I remember when DeAndre Jordan, he signed with the Mavericks, but he came back to the Clippers. And really from that point on as well, nothing was really ever the same for this team. But of course, he ended up leaving and going to Dallas. And that made it the end of the Lob City era. The Clippers were still, a pretty decent team. They were making the playoffs, but you fast forward to this season, the Clippers had the ultimate opportunity. They were able to acquire Kawhi Leonard. They traded for Paul George, pretty much giving up a lot of draft picks. This team was seen as one of the best teams in basketball. They had a deep, loaded roster. In the first game of the season against the Lakers, they proved that this team was definitely here. But as we all know, this core really didn't play that much together. Kawhi was still load managing, and Paul George was out a lot with injuries. And they blew another 3-1 lead, this time to the Denver Nuggets in the playoffs. And the same issue revolves around this team as well right now. Locker room issues, injuries, and coaching problems from Doc Rivers as well for being more lean on his star players, something that he also did in Boston. There's a lot of problems that this Clippers team has faced. And even when they do have success on their roster, still bad things happen. The good part for this team is though that they can recover from this, especially if they make some big moves over free agency to trade away some of the players that they don't need on this roster. Well, as you all see, the Clippers have some of the worst luck in the NBA draft. Not only that, but you add that with bad management, having a racist owner for decades who would eventually be banned for life and sued from the NBA. This curse runs deep with this Clippers team. They've had so many opportunities on many players over the years that they could have legitimately been championship contenders. They could have won NBA championships, but they've missed out on so many good players in the NBA draft. And even when they had gotten some of these players, these guys have either gotten hurt or they were just traded away. They had so many opportunities to compete, but they always blew them. And even when they did have the success on their rosters, especially in the 2010s, of course, something as bad always happened. If it's locker room issues, injuries, something has always happened. And that same thing happened this season. What's going on, man? In 2000 as well, they were already labeled as one of the most cursed teams in sports. Nothing has changed for this Clippers team so far. But as I've said before, they have an opportunity next season to change those things, and maybe they could make the Western Conference Finals next year. Maybe finally they can break through, which will be a huge accomplishment for a team that hasn't made it to the Western Conference Finals ever in their 50 years of existence. And now you're moving to a new arena in a few seasons. You're creating your own identity, but they will always be the little brother of the Lakers. Looking at all the history and all the bad decisions and everything that this franchise has done, even when they did get the good owner in Steve Ballmer and he created a good, management, things have always just still fell wrong this far. So if things can finally change for next season, You know, there is hope. There is still hope for this Clippers team because they have key pieces on their roster, but you can't change the past. And what the past is still saying is that this team is still cursed, but only time will tell. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Making new basketball videos every week. I hope you guys have a great day. Peace.